She only requested a vegan meal. Instead of receiving the bare minimum of respect, she was humiliated in front of the entire first-class cabin. They told her she should be grateful to even be there, then implied she would be more appropriate sitting in the back, simply because of the color of her skin. No one spoke up. Not the crew, not the passengers, not even the captain. Everyone pretended they didn't hear, didn't see, didn't care. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have anticipated, was that the woman they tried to push out didn't just deserve to sit in that seat. She could make the entire plane bow its head without ever raising her voice. This isn't a story of misunderstanding. This is a story of power, of what happens when calm meets arrogant prejudice at over 30,000 feet. And it didn't begin with a greeting, but with a cold food tray, a loud enough snide remark for the whole row to hear, and a system far too used to getting away with things, without consequence. Pay attention to every detail, every silence, every condescending glance, every moment they thought no one noticed. It all led to a turning point powerful enough to shake a billion-dollar industry. The noisy bustle of Gate 17, Terminal D Larkspur International Airport, echoed behind Celeste Morgan as she approached the check-in counter. Her burgundy suit stood out in the crowd, each step purposeful, unhurried. Celeste had nothing to prove. Her presence was as natural as the faint scent of perfume trailing in the air. In her hand was a first-class boarding pass seat, 2O, booked in advance with a confirmed request for a vegan meal made 3 days prior. After 12 straight days of high-intensity work negotiating with intercontinental trade partners and nearly losing a critical deal, her one goal tonight was simple: to fly home in peace. The gate agent scanned her ticket without even looking up. Next he said curtly, no smile, no greeting. Just a small gesture, not uncommon, but enough to make someone feel diminished. Celeste stepped into the jet bridge, her heels clicking softly on the aluminum floor. She entered the first-class cabin, where the soft golden lighting, cream leather seats, and gleaming metallic finishes created a sense of refined luxury, a world she had reached on her own, relying on no one. Her seat by the window in row 2A awaited her. She placed her carry-on in the overhead bin, adjusted her coat, and sat down. As she settled in, she noticed a blonde flight attendant chatting cheerfully with the couple in 3C and 3D. They laughed at something, and the attendant gently placed 2 glasses of champagne on their tables, her smile still radiant. But when she reached Celeste's row, she said nothing. No greeting, no eye contact, no smile. Just set down a small bottle of water on the armrest and moved on without a glance back. Celeste leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," she said gently. The flight attendant stopped, still facing away. "Yes. Could I see the menu when you have a moment?" Celeste's tone was calm, entirely neutral. "We'll be back later," the attendant replied shortly, then walked off. Celeste exhaled softly, leaning back. She wasn't seeking conflict, not tonight, but something was clearly off. 10 minutes passed. The attendants served the other passengers smoothly, menus, distributed orders taken. Wine poured, even personal preferences remembered. But Celeste waited. No menu, no questions. Aside from the lukewarm bottle of water on her tray, she received nothing. Another flight attendant walked by. Celeste gently signaled. "Excuse me," she smiled. "I had requested a vegan meal. It was confirmed in my booking." The younger attendant, seemingly new, looked a bit uneasy. "I'll double-check." Then she disappeared behind the curtain. Not long after the earlier attendant returned, the name tag read Veronica. She didn't lean down to speak as she had with others. No soft tone. No friendliness. She stood upright, cold. "We don't have that meal," she said plainly. "I pre-ordered it," Celeste replied, her gaze steady. "That request was tied to my C-class." Veronica raised an eyebrow, then gave a half-smile, mocking. "We didn't prepare that option for your kind of ticket." The sentence hung with implication. It wasn't about the seat class. It was about something else. Celeste stared directly at her. "I'm sitting in first class," she said clearly. "I purchased this ticket 3 weeks ago." Veronica shrugged. "We only have chicken and beef. If you want something else, you can wait until we land." The air around them seemed to freeze. The man across the aisle glanced briefly, then looked away. The woman next to him bowed her head, pretending to focus on her phone. Celeste remained still. No anger, no protest. Just one deep inhale through her nose. Veronica stood there clearly waiting for a reaction, but Celeste gave her none. "Water is fine," she said composed. "I'll wait." Veronica said nothing. She turned and walked away, her steps suddenly heavier. Celeste sat still for a long moment. Her hand remained on the water bottle. The faint reflection on the gold rim of her seat mirrored her face. She looked at herself in it. Then she looked around. Everyone else had been served. Everyone else had been acknowledged. Only she had been ignored. She sat upright, quietly opened her bag, took out her phone. One gentle swipe of her thumb and a short message. "Boarded. Everything has been recorded." She hit send, no signature, no explanation. Then she put the phone away and leaned back in her seat. This wasn't a new kind of insult. Celeste had experienced more polished versions of discrimination at conferences, hotels, charity galas, any space where her presence made others uncomfortable. But this time was different. It was blatant, deliberate, intentional. She didn't know who was watching now, but that no longer mattered. She looked around again. Everyone had been served. Everyone was being cared for. Acknowledged everyone but her, as if she had never existed. Celeste Morgan gently squared her shoulders, then opened her handbag and took out her phone. A swipe of her thumb, a simple message. "On board, recording, initiated. No explanation, no signature." She hit send. Then she put the phone away, sat still once more, letting the injustice settle into the air around her like a dense fog. This wasn't the first time she had witnessed more refined versions of this moment in boardroom meetings, in luxurious hotel lobbies, at fundraising galas, in any place where her presence made others uncomfortable. But on this flight, the disregard was no longer subtle. It was blatant, deliberate. The soft clink of food trays and murmured confirmations of special meals echoed from the front. First class was wrapped in an air of refined service. But Celeste sat upright, eyes forward, hands on her lap, expression unreadable. She wasn't hungry yet, her stomach twisted. Not from food, but from what she knew was about to come. Across the aisle, champagne glasses were filled. Other passengers casually discussed how they liked their meat, prepared light laughter, gentle clinks of toasts. Celeste remained still. No one came near. 20 minutes passed. Her patience began to crack under the weight of intentional neglect. She pressed the call button. Gently, the signal lit up above her amber, flickering quietly under the dim cabin lights. She waited. 30 seconds. No one came. A flight attendant passed by without even a glance. The light remained on. A second attendant walked past her gaze, briefly skimming over Celeste, before turning to the next passenger, bending down to ask sweetly, "Would you like your sauce on the side?" or poured over. Celeste's fingers clenched slightly. This wasn't negligence anymore. This was theater, a performance of exclusion playing out in front of the entire first-class cabin with the silent complicity of an audience that said nothing. The man in the seat next to her glanced over, then turned back to his conversation. The woman beside him leaned in, whispering something behind the sleeve of her blazer. The air was no longer private. It had become public, a collective rehearsal. Finally, another voice broke through the soft murmur. An older male flight attendant, hair graying at the temples, polished in appearance, stopped beside Celeste's seat. His voice rang, just loud enough to cut through the cabin's outer shell of politeness, but carried no warmth. "You know," he said with a crooked smile, not looking at her but addressing the space around them. "Some passengers should learn to eat what they're given. This isn't a restaurant where you order à la carte." A few heads turned. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the air. Celeste didn't move. Her gaze locked onto him sharp and steady. "Excuse me," she said, voice low but clear-edged with precise calm. The attendant name-tag, reading Thomas, finally looked her in the eye, and for a moment his expression faltered before tightening again. "We can't accommodate every special request," he stated flatly. His voice wasn't raised, but it brimmed with contempt. "Some people think they're entitled to different treatment." The words hung in the air, like smoke curling around the people nearby. The woman in 2C shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The man a row behind cleared his throat, eyes cast downward. Celeste pressed her lips together, then answered evenly. "I requested this meal in advance, and the airline confirmed it. I'm not asking for anything beyond what was promised." Thomas forced a strained smile. "Sometimes the system doesn't process every request." He turned his back and walked away, leaving a silence heavier than the words he'd spoken. Celeste leaned back, her mind working like a battlefield strategist. She picked up her phone again, opened the Notes app and typed a few lines. Flight 681. Timestamp, recorded witnesses present. She didn't send it. Not yet, but she wouldn't forget. As the dessert cart glided past and post-meal drinks were offered to every other passenger, Celeste continued to wait. She pressed the call button again. No one came. 5 minutes passed, 10. The light kept blinking. At last a young female flight attendant clearly knew walked by and hesitated. She paused. Celeste looked directly at her. Not with anger, but with a gaze that said everything. "You see it. Don't pretend you don't." The girl looked momentarily afraid but said nothing. Then she walked on. Celeste turned to face the window. Not out of defeat, out of calculation. Her posture remained poised, her movements restrained. But inside her, another engine had ignited not one of rage, but of resolve. This was no longer about the food, no longer about the service. It was a public, deliberate reminder that she was not welcome here. The silence she held was not surrender. It was a weapon. A silence honed over years, not for retreat, but for revelation. Around her, the cabin was taut with unspoken tension. Everyone knew something had and was happening, yet no one acted. They watched. A gallery of silent observers dressed in expensive suits and designer scarves, choosing silence as reflex. And in that carefully constructed air of willful ignorance, the next blow came not from the crew, but from those seated near her, the same ones who had been clinking glasses minutes earlier, as if this were their private club. The voice came from behind low, but not low enough to go unheard. "Young lady," the man said in crisp, proper British English, each word delivered with the ease of someone used to being listened to. "I think you might be more comfortable in another section. You seem rather out of place here." Celeste Morgan turned her head slowly. Her posture remained unchanged. Her eyes met his. She didn't look away. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" she asked. Not because she hadn't heard, but because she wanted him to repeat it, so everyone around could hear it too. "I mean," the man continued, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the cabin, "this area has a certain atmosphere. Quiet people tend to keep to themselves. Nothing personal. Just an observation." Celeste stayed silent. She let the silence stretch like a tightening rope between them. The man began to fidget, his gaze shifting. Then she spoke. "You're suggesting I should leave my seat because my presence makes you uncomfortable?" "Not me," he corrected quickly, offering a paper-thin smile. "It's others." And what is it about me that makes me seem out of place? Celeste asked, her voice still calm and unforced. He faltered, looked toward the woman sitting next to him. She immediately buried her eyes in her phone, feigning busyness. The way you speak, the way you keep calling the attendants. It's made some people uneasy. What a strange logic. She was the one ignored, dismissed, disrespected, and now she was the one being blamed for making others uncomfortable. Before Celeste could respond, a familiar face appeared. Madeline, the original flight attendant, who had ignored her greeting, refused her menu, and denied her meal request returned. With her was a larger male attendant. Face expressionless, cold. Celeste had not seen him before, Ms. Morgan, Madeline said in a syrupy, rehearsed tone, each word sounding like it had been practiced in a mirror. We understand there's been a bit of tension regarding the service. To ensure a smooth flight for everyone, we'd like to offer you a seat in business class. Very comfortable. And we believe you'll have more privacy there. Celeste looked at her, unable to mask her surprise. You mean I have to leave my seat because someone else is uncomfortable that I requested something that was already confirmed? Madeline's smile faltered. It's not about blame. We just want to keep the atmosphere pleasant. The goal is for everyone to have a nice experience. Pleasant, Celeste repeated, her voice, ice cold. And pleasant means removing the only person who spoke up. The male attendant stepped forward, arms folded across his chest. Ma'am, we're trying to assist. If you're dissatisfied, you can file a complaint after landing. Celeste looked at him and said softly, Don't worry, I most certainly will. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. A few passengers were now clearly eavesdropping. A man across the aisle turned away, his eyes heavy with guilt. The couple in 3D shifted awkwardly in their seats, but no one said a word. Not a single person spoke up to say, This is wrong. Celeste could feel it. A silent agreement, a quiet consent, from those who wanted her gone, so they wouldn't have to witness the very injustice unfolding within this refined space. No, Celeste finally said, I'm not going anywhere. Madeline's eyes flickered. Then we'll have to make a report. Celeste gave a faint smirk. Go ahead. Conversation faded, the clinking of utensils against porcelain softened. Glasses still clinked, but no one looked at her anymore. Not a single glance, not one word in her defense. No one came back again. Instead, another attendant approached, older, thin hair, neatly silvered, with a smile so faint it was nearly invisible. His name tag read Douglas. The way he walked, shoulders straight, arms tucked, made clear. He was not just an attendant, but someone who believed he set the tone, rules, and boundaries of the first-class cabin. Miss Morgan, he said, his voice so politely clipped it bordered on mockery. We've found something for you to eat. He presented a tray as if offering a treat to a child, not out of kindness, but pity. On the tray was a small plastic container of cold couscous salad, a few wilted greens pressed into one corner, and a half-filled glass of water. Celeste looked at it, did not touch it. This is not the meal I ordered, she said evenly. Douglas's smile faltered. It's the only thing we have. You should be grateful we managed anything at all. A vegan meal is standard, Celeste replied. Especially when confirmed in advance. Douglas lowered his voice just enough to be heard clearly. Next time, remember where you are. Not every place caters to every request. His eyes scanned the tray once more, then placed it on her table with a soft clack. And perhaps he added, drawing out the words in that same falsely polite tone, You should consider that sitting here is a privilege, not a default right. Plenty of people with money still don't get to choose this seat. Celeste didn't take her eyes off him. And some people, she said quietly, kill with a smile. The silence between them stretched taut as a wire. Around them, a few people held their breath, pretending not to listen but unable to look away like reluctant witnesses. Douglas said nothing. He turned and walked off the edge of his uniform sleeve, brushing past like a quiet rebuke. Celeste looked at the tray again. The plastic container had begun to fog over. It was inedible, not because it was the wrong dish or cold, but because it was a symbol of disdain, wrapped in professionalism. She gently lifted the tray and placed it at the outer edge of her armrest away from herself. Then she wiped her hands with a cloth napkin, sat up straight again. No food needed. What she needed was clarity. Douglas turned and walked away, the sweep of his uniform sleeve acting as a final punctuation mark to the insult he'd just delivered. He walked slowly, but with clear satisfaction, as if he had just taught an unruly passenger a lesson. Celeste Morgan looked down at the food tray still sitting on her table. Condensation had begun to fog up the inside of the cold plastic container. The meal was inedible, not just because it was wrong or cold, but because of what it represented. It was a symbol of contempt wrapped in the packaging of service. Disrespect, written in the language of procedure. Celeste slowly lifted the tray, turned, and placed it on the edge of her armrest, setting it away from herself like one would distance a stain. Then she pulled out a cloth napkin, wiped her hands gently, and returned to her upright posture, eyes calm like a commander who needs no weapon. She didn't need their food. She needed clarity, accountability, and consequences. In seat 2D nearby, a woman had been watching everything from behind a pair of designer sunglasses. She stirred slightly as if about to say something, then didn't. Her silence, too, was a choice. Celeste felt it all, the invisible alliances, the silent glances of agreement, the complicity tucked neatly inside cashmere coats. She had played this chess game before, and she knew their rules. But what they didn't know was that she hadn't come to play. She came to win, and every side-eye, every thinly veiled insult, every meal tray shoved at her like refuse. It was all being recorded, not just in her memory, but in a system she had triggered in the very first minutes of boarding. The message she sent over 20 minutes ago now sat in the inbox of someone this airline couldn't ignore. Celeste Morgan's name wasn't just on the passenger list. It was also in the records of an agency they assumed was irrelevant, an agency with far more authority than they imagined. The cabin buzzed with a subtle wave of discomfort, not because of what had happened to Celeste, but because she wasn't reacting the way they expected. No shouting, no anger, no spectacle. Her composure unsettled them. It made their cruelty harder to justify. And perhaps for that very reason, they pushed it further. A new figure appeared standing beside her seat. This time, not the polished uniform of a flight attendant, but a black polo shirt. The uniform of the airline's security division, used only in special incidents. Beside him was Madeline, and a younger woman in uniform, clutching a clipboard tightly, her eyes trying to remain neutral. Ms. Morgan, the security officer, began, his voice low and firm. "We've received information about your conduct during the meal service. For documentation purposes, we need your formal acknowledgement." Celeste looked up, eyes calm. "Acknowledgement of what?" The girl with the clipboard stepped forward slightly. "This form notes that you declined the available meal options and did not accept the alternatives provided by the flight crew." "I declined nothing." Celeste replied, her voice cold and sharp. "I requested the meal. I pre-ordered a meal that was confirmed before the flight. Your crew failed to provide it. That's a system failure, not mine." "That may be the case," the security officer said, "but we still need a record that you are aware no special service will be provided for the remainder of the flight." "You mean?" Celeste said, her voice now hard as steel. "You want me to sign a document stating that I will no longer be treated equally to the other passengers?" No one answered. The silence was the answer. Has any other passenger in first class been asked to sign something like this? Celeste continued. Has anyone signed a form because their wine wasn't cold enough or their steak was overcooked? The young woman with the clipboard shifted uneasily. Madeline folded her arms. The security officer's gaze darkened. If you refuse to sign, he said, we will note this as non-compliance. With crew directives, Celeste didn't move. Only her voice broke the air, clear and unwavering. So I'm being coerced, threatened really into signing a statement that undermines me. No one is threatening you, he replied, though his jaw clenched. We're simply maintaining order, and your idea of order, Celeste said bluntly, relies on my silence. I won't sign. Madeline opened her mouth, but before she could speak, another voice came from row 4C behind them. She's the only one being treated like this. Everyone turned. A young black man phone and hand-screen glowing his camera app actively recording. I've been watching the whole thing, he said, and this doesn't look like maintaining order. It looks like intimidation. The entire cabin turned to look. The protective shell that had shielded the crew's silence began to crack. Sir, recording other passengers is against policy. Madeline interjected. You'll need to delete the video immediately. The security officer stepped forward, voice icy. I need you to cooperate. Are you kidding me? The man shot back. I'm documenting a basic human rights violation. Delete it, the officer repeated, or we will confiscate the device. That's illegal, the man muttered, but he hesitated. His thumb hovered above the screen. A second later, under pressure, he tapped delete. Celeste watched it all, her heart still steady, but a slow burning fury began to rise in her chest. They were good at this cold, no shouting, no visible aggression, just leaning on internal protocol and pre-programmed smiles. That was their strategy, intentional denial, threats with no paper trail. The clipboard disappeared. So did the threat of documentation, but no one would forget. She could feel the air thickening in the cabin, not from altitude, but from the truth caught then erased on command. And it was in that exact moment when a truth was wiped away. Without a trace that Celeste knew they were prepared to go even further. They were ready. She stared straight ahead, unmoving. The security officer remained in the aisle longer than necessary, as if waiting for her to say something. Anything. So they could write the version of events they were already prepared to tell. But she said nothing. She did not move. And it was that silence, that absolute control that shook their grip. Celeste Morgan didn't move. Not a twitch. Not a single word. And that more than anything made them uncomfortable. 10 minutes later, Madeline returned. But this time she wasn't alone. She walked beside a slim man in a navy suit with a silver wing insignia pinned neatly to his chest. His gait was textbook perfect. His expression stern, as if rehearsed in a mirror. Celeste recognized the type instantly. An operations supervisor. The kind airlines deploy to resolve situations with polite language veiling an ultimatum. He leaned down beside her seat, his voice deep and measured as though offering a courteous proposal. Ms. Morgan, he began, the words sounding memorized. Before we proceed further, I'd like to clarify a few things. We've received multiple reports from the flight crew that your behavior has caused discomfort to staff and other passengers. Celeste tilted her head. My behavior, she asked, voice soft but sharp. You mean requesting the meal I paid for, refusing to sign a false statement, and remaining seated in the seat I purchased? He blinked, clearly not expecting her composure. Not any specific action, he replied. More so the disruption of the cabin environment. We have a duty to ensure that all passengers feel at ease. And in this case, Celeste said slowly, that means removing the only black woman who dared to speak up. The supervisor didn't answer. Instead, He glanced toward the security officer standing nearby, seemingly ready. Then he continued, "If this situation continues to escalate, we'll have no choice but to classify you as a monitored passenger. This may impact your ability to travel with our airline in the future." Celeste's face didn't change. "Say it plainly," she replied. "You're threatening to blacklist me." He paused for a beat. "This is not a threat," he said, voice as thin as paper. "Merely a goodwill warning." Celeste offered a slight smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Goodwill," she repeated, "from the same people who ignored my request, humiliated me in public, and silenced the only person who tried to tell the truth." The supervisor straightened. "I'm here to de-escalate." "Then start with your crew," Celeste said coolly. "Not me." He didn't have time to reply before another voice emerged, small but clear, not from authority, but from a shadowed corner in the rear. A young female employee, likely an intern, stood pressed against the divider near the galley. She had been silent all this time, head-bowed eyes avoiding Celeste. But now she stepped forward gently, hesitating for a moment, before leaning in just enough to whisper out of anyone else's earshot. "You don't understand," the girl said, voice trembling. "This isn't about policy. It's not about the meal." She swallowed hard. They just don't want you here. Not in this cabin, not in this light." Celeste held her breath. The girl continued, "If you know what's good for you, you'll let it go. These people, this airline, it belongs to them. It always has, and they don't like to share." And in that moment the curtain lifted. All the professional smiles, the pristine uniforms, the neutral corporate tones, all of it was just a mask for something deeper, older, and more rotten. Celeste didn't respond. She didn't have to. This time her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy, because now she knew she wasn't just up against a policy. She was up against a legacy. Celeste let the supervisor continue his empty, rehearsed monologue. She nodded slightly as if acknowledging, but not agreeing, then watched him walk away as his silhouette disappeared toward the galley. Celeste calmly opened her handbag. She took out her phone, not to send a message. There was no more speculation, no more implication, only a raw truth handed to her by someone no longer willing to pretend. And it was in that moment, not the wrong meal, not the sneers, not the blacklist threat, that Celeste's patience finally met its limit. She didn't look around, didn't create a scene. She needed only one gesture, a tap on a hidden icon within an app not visible on the home screen, an app not available to the average passenger. It was built for situations beyond the reach of ordinary silence. The screen lit up green. One tap, the call connected. On the other end, no greeting, just a short male voice. "Proceed." Celeste responded immediately. Her voice wasn't raised, wasn't shaky. It was professional, precise. Activate D, confirm, acknowledgement. A beat of silence. Then the voice replied colder this time. "Confirmed, impact will initiate within 8 minutes." She ended the call, placed the phone back in her bag. Didn't look around, didn't check to see who had witnessed it, because from this point forward, what would happen was no longer about attention. It was about consequence. 5 minutes passed in silence. The crew resumed their duties with visible caution, but kept a careful distance from seat 2A, as if Celeste were surrounded by a high-pressure zone. The supervisor, the one who had just threatened her, returned to the back, likely to draft a report on a passenger of concern. But exactly 6 minutes after Celeste made the call, the first signal sounded. A strange chime rang from the cockpit communication system. Not the usual tone, but an encrypted signal reserved for top-priority commands. In the cockpit, Captain Landon Pierce frowned at the control panel. A flashing message appeared on the emergency channel. Immediate action required. Cease all services. Crew, hold position. Level 1 override authorization. Contact headquarters. He turned to the co-pilot. Did you touch the comms? No, sir. Captain Pierce immediately patched through to ground control. This is Flight 681 requesting confirmation. We just received an unusual directive. The response came after a beat. 681 maintain current course. The issue is being handled directly by executive operations. Do not proceed with standard in-flight service copy. That the captain replied, his voice noticeably lower, awaiting further instruction. In the cabin, everything still appeared normal on the surface. Passengers kept watching movies. A few had slipped on sleep masks. No one realized an undercurrent had begun to swell beneath the surface. Service carts were quietly rolled back toward the galley. Flight attendants whispered in hidden corners, eyes darting repeatedly toward the cockpit, confusion clearly on their faces. Madeline noticed something unusual in her colleagues' expressions. Attention tight as a bowstring. At that moment, the male security officer's phone buzzed inside his uniform pocket. He checked the screen, then froze. Cut all interaction with Seat 2A, he whispered urgently to Douglas, the same attendant who had mocked Celeste earlier. Command flag's been activated. No one approaches her anymore. Headquarters is involved. Douglas's eyes widened. You mean direct superiors? The top, he muttered through clenched teeth. This kind of order gets people fired. Madeline stepped into the small group huddling in the galley, her face visibly uneasy. It's because of her, she asked. No one answered. The security officer simply turned his head to look toward Celeste, still seated motionless in 2A eyes, fixed forward like a queen calmly watching her court crumble from within. Who is she? He whispered, voice so low it was barely audible to himself. No one had the answer. The silence now didn't belong to Celeste. It belonged to them. Her stillness had seized the room. Everyone in the cabin seemed to sense something had shifted. The flight crew, now visibly shaken, didn't know how to explain what was happening, so they did the only thing they could. They kept their distance. Then the plane's intercom crackled to life again. Captain Pierce's voice was no longer the warm, familiar tone of a welcome message. Ladies and gentlemen, per directive from our airline headquarters, all in-flight services will be suspended for the remainder of the flight. Thank you for your understanding. There was no further explanation, just the faint hiss of static, then silence. Heads began to turn, not all at once, but gradually, cautiously. A ripple of realization rolled through the cabin like waves. Something major was happening. Celeste remained still, letting the silence stretch and settle. Then she stood up, not abruptly, not theatrically. Just a calm, deliberate movement weighted with finality. She adjusted her blazer with the same precision she used when choosing her words. Took one step into the aisle. Every gaze locked onto her, even those who had pretended not to see her before. She walked to the front of the first-class cabin. Stopped, turned to face them all. And then she spoke, not loudly, but with a voice that sliced cleanly through the tension in the air. My name is Celeste Morgan, she said. Her tone was low, steady, not a beat off. I am the Deputy Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the United States and lead negotiator for the Global Airspace Agreement. I am en route to finalize a $2 billion bilateral accord between the U.S. government and international partners. Whispers erupted like dominoes. Sharp intakes of breath. Eyes widened, mouths slightly open. Some of you may know what that means, she continued. For those who don't, this aircraft, this airline, falls under direct observation in connection with the multilateral agreement regarding shared international airspace rights. She glanced briefly toward the rows behind her. Every action on this flight has been recorded, time-stamped, and witnessed. Your flight crew, she said, her voice no louder, but now honed like a blade, refused to serve a pre-confirmed meal. denied basic service standards, attempted to coerce me into signing a baseless document, a demand made to no other passenger, and finally silenced the only person who tried to document it. She stood, tall eyes sweeping across every face in the cabin. This is not a customer service issue. This is a human rights violation, a case of systemic discrimination against a first-class black woman passenger. And that behavior, she paused, will not go unanswered. No one in the cabin moved. Not the man in 3B who had made mocking remarks. Not Madeline, who now stood frozen near the galley. And certainly not Douglas, whose face had gone pale, as he stood mute beside the service cart. Currently, Celeste continued. A formal investigation has been launched by the U.S. Department of Transportation and the International Aviation Oversight Board. This airline will be contacted immediately upon landing. Every name, action, and word will be submitted in full to both investigative and diplomatic review. At that moment, a man in a dark suit rose from a row behind. He gently lifted the edge of his jacket to reveal a badge with a federal seal tucked inside. A short nod to Celeste, full of respect. She didn't turn. "This is my colleague," she said. "He's been observing the entire incident in real time. There will be no denial, no cover-up." Celeste Morgan's voice rang out sharp as a blade slicing through the thick tension in the air. The eyes on this flight are not just from the federal level. They're global. Several passengers turned to look at Madeline, whose face had gone pale as paper. Douglas stood frozen beside the service cart, his hand gripping the steel handle, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. And to those who turned away, Celeste continued, her voice now steeped in something deeper than disappointment, truth. "Remember this moment every time silence seems easier than speaking up." Not a single passenger moved. The crew stood motionless at their posts as if waiting for orders, but not from the cockpit anymore. They knew the authority had changed hands. Celeste returned to her seat, composed her gaze steady. Her phone began to vibrate gently, a stream of encrypted messages from the back-end operation teams coming through. She didn't need to say anything more. Her words had landed like a gavel, louder than the worst turbulence this plane had ever encountered, and the echoes were only beginning to spread. The aircraft began to decelerate as it reached a remote stand far from the main terminal gates. Outside, 3 black SUVs and a federal security transport van bearing special insignias approached. This wasn't coincidence. It was protocol. Not for a criminal, but for a serious diplomatic breach, the boarding stairs were deployed. No passengers were allowed to disembark. 2 federal aviation inspectors boarded first, badges glinting under the cabin lights. They weren't panicked, just deadly serious. Following them was a representative from the State Department, clipboard in hand, walking directly to Celeste's seat. She rose, no words, just a slight nod. "Ma'am," the representative said with absolute respect, "we are here to formally record your statement as requested. The airspace agreement," he continued, "was suspended 5 minutes ago, pending further directive from you." Celeste nodded. "Proceed with formal withdrawal." "Cite violation of equitable treatment standards per International Accord 419. "Understood," the representative replied immediately, relaying the command into his earpiece. The words echoed in the hushed cabin like thunder. Some passengers turned to each other, faces still struggling to comprehend everything they had just witnessed. But they understood one thing. This wasn't a personal incident. It was the collapse of an empire, one built on obedience through silence. Celeste exited the aircraft with her security detail. Meanwhile, 2 additional teams spread through the cabin. One group began interviewing passengers identified as witnesses. The other, composed of executives from the airline, arrived with a clear task: damage control. But it was already too late. News of the incident had leaked just hours after the plane had taken off. A video, the one secretly recorded by the young black man in seat 4C, had been automatically recovered from cloud backup. though he had been forced to delete it on board his phone, had already synced a copy to his storage system before he complied. By the time the plane landed, 3 journalists had obtained the footage, one of them broadcasting it live on a major network. Within 24 hours, headlines dominated global media. U.S. Diplomat humiliated on flight $2. Billion-dollar deal. Canceled airline faces collapse. After racial discrimination allegations. First-class or second-class citizen. Viral video triggers international investigation. In the press conferences that followed, Celeste didn't say much. She let the video speak for itself. The world saw how the crew ignored her, how she was served a cold meal while others enjoyed champagne and premium beef, how she was threatened with blacklisting and asked to sign an absurd waiver to silence her. And above all, that final moment when she stood and declared who she was became a clip shared worldwide like wildfire in a storm. Within 48 hours, the airline's CEO issued a public apology. But the apology was widely dismissed as a hollow PR stunt. The stock plummeted 13% overnight. That weekend, 4 senior executives resigned. Captain Pierce, Madeline Douglas, and the supervisor who had threatened Celeste. All were fired pending formal investigation. But the Department of Transportation didn't stop there. A full-scale internal audit was launched, reopening numerous past passenger complaints, many of which had been handled internally and buried. Many showed clear signs of systemic subtle discrimination. The airline once prided itself on the slogan, "Luxury selectively offered." But what had truly been selective turned out to be exclusion. Celeste's legal team, backed by government support and international human rights organizations, filed an emergency motion to freeze the airline's eligibility for 4 pending global aviation contracts. The consequences were swift. 12 months after the infamous Flight 681, the skies seemed quieter, not because there were fewer planes, but because the noise of that scandal had settled into a different kind of turbulence reflection. In the past year, the airline, once thought untouchable, had struggled to recover. Not financially, it survived barely, but culturally a wound, not easily healed by press releases or rebranding campaigns. The headlines faded, but the legacy remained. Celeste Morgan returned to her duties at the State Department, resuming high-level negotiations with her characteristic calm. She declined every talk show invitation, refused to appear on television, ignored all book and film offers. Her message didn't lie in words. It lived in action. Celeste Morgan never gave a single televised interview. She declined daytime talk show invitations, passed on late-night guest spots, and politely ignored all book and documentary film offers. Her statement wasn't made in words. It was made in action, and that silence echoed louder than any speech could. Yet the ripple of her resilience continued to reach places no one expected. At a small office inside a nonprofit organization focused on restorative justice and workplace equity. Lauren James, once known as Madeline, on that flight sat quietly at her desk, sorting through packets for a community outreach event. She had shed her flight attendant uniform along with the professional coldness once masked by polite smiles. Now she wore a simple blouse, soft shoes, and carried something rare: humility. No one had forced her to volunteer. There was no court order requiring her presence. After being fired, Lauren fell into silence. Not because of public backlash, but because of the image she saw when she rewatched the footage. She watched it again and again. The way she pressed her lips together, how she ignored Celeste's request, how she stayed silent in moments when she could have spoken up. What haunted her most wasn't what she did, but what she didn't do. And so, on the 1-year anniversary of the flight, Lauren posted a handwritten message brief, unsigned, on the organization's social media page. To the woman I once ignored, I saw you, I dismissed you, and I was wrong. Not just for what I did, but for letting silence be my shield. I spend every day learning how to truly listen. I will never forget the lesson you gave me. even if I may not deserve your forgiveness. The message didn't go viral. It didn't become some neat redemption story. It was just a small punctuation mark in a larger movement already underway. Several other former staff members also came forward, not to defend themselves, but to confront the truth. One of them was Ernest Halverson, the captain of Flight 681. One evening he appeared on a late-night news segment not to excuse his actions, but to publicly accept responsibility. He wore a plain shirt, silver hair, neatly combed hands, clasped tightly on his lap. 40 years of flying, he said, voice trembling slightly. I thought I'd seen everything, that I had the right to judge who belonged in first class. But that day she reminded me I hadn't learned the most basic truth of this job to honor human dignity above all else. He paused, swallowing hard. I didn't speak up, and for that I'll carry the shame for the rest of my life. But if my admission helps someone else learn what I failed to, maybe I haven't failed completely. The host didn't interrupt. There was no applause. Just a quiet camera fade. Across the country, aviation schools began adding anti-bias training into their core curriculum. Airlines revised their internal policies, not just with dry legal text, but with training programs that emphasized humanity over mere compliance. Though many remained skeptical about the sincerity of these reforms, one thing was clear: the standard had shifted. As for Celeste, she quietly continued her work, negotiating international agreements, cross-continental trade deals with the same strategic mind that once dismantled a billion-dollar contract with a single phone call. But on the anniversary of the flight, she received a letter. Not from a secretary, not through an advisor, no return address. Just a plain white envelope inside of which were 4 words. Thank you for standing up. No signature, but attached was a small note on the back. You changed my skies. Celeste didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply folded the letter, placed it gently in the drawer beside her desk, and returned to her work. The world knew who she was, but more importantly, the world saw who they could become if they dared to choose change. Celeste Morgan's story may have landed with that fateful flight, but the message she left behind is still flying in the hearts of those who witnessed it, in the minds of those who once chose silence, and in the souls of those who've been sidelined simply for being different. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to rally a crowd. She didn't need to slam tables, shout in anger, or cause a scene. It was her intentional silence, her steady gaze, her words sharp as razors, and her actions precise as a surgeon's blade that became the most powerful weapon of all. And she used it to slice open the truth, exposing a system long accustomed to bearing wrongs beneath procedure and polite smiles. This isn't just a story about one woman being mistreated. It's a reminder to all of us. You don't need power to have a voice. You only need to stand up once at the right moment. If you've ever felt dismissed, if you've ever witnessed injustice and didn't know what to do, if you've ever chosen silence because it felt safer, easier, or less disruptive, then maybe Celeste's story touched something in you. Because the world doesn't need more silent watchers. The world needs people who act even if it's just a sentence, a stare, or a refusal to bow. If this story made you pause, if your heart beat a little faster at some point, if you saw Celeste not just as a character, but as a reflection of yourself or someone you know, then share her story. Tap like to let us know. You value this message. Tap share so someone you care about can feel it too, and hit subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. Stories that might just change the way we see the world and ourselves. Because we believe every view is a heart reached, every comment is a step toward empathy, and every person who dares to stand is a light in the dark. Thank you for walking alongside Celeste Morgan on this journey. We'll see you in the next story where justice isn't just a dream, but something we choose to build together.